Welcome, everybody, to The Foods That Built Spain. My name is Mariana Ruiz de Medina, and thank you so much for joining me today. This class is one that is focusing on the concepts of food history through the context of food in Spain. So, we're going to talk a lot about how food history is studied and works, and take a look at some individual food items and some recipes that help demonstrate some of these particular academic concepts. So, the major topics today, we're going to cover food as a political construct, meaning food as a discipline and a area of study. And then we're going to go through six individual foods that sort of correspond to these six major powers over the course of medieval Spain's history that really kind of shaped how Spain looks at and thinks about food. There will be a 5-minute break between the first and second halves, and each of these sections will talk about both the overarching historical context of that food item, the food item itself, and then a quick recipe for each of those. Food as a political construct. Food history as an academic discipline is significantly younger than most of us think. It started taking shape in the early 20th century, roughly around 1929, 1930, is when the first real study of food history began. What we know as food history today got filtered through a series of different lenses, both economic and dietary focused, through the human rights campaigns of the mid 20th century, and didn't really begin taking off as an academic discipline until the 1990s and early. Spain itself played an interesting role in some of this early food history when the economic focus of a couple of different papers was on the Spanish parts of the transatlantic trade. Food has very much over time become an interdisciplinary pursuit. It covers environmental science, anthropology, sociology, and a lot more. And as a tool in the SCA, helps us to demythologize the Middle Ages and contextualize food culture for better SCA scholarship. However, food history is so much more than just individual cookbooks. But testing the limits of what is available in written history can push us to looking at different sources through the lens of food as a way of understanding more about food in a larger cultural context. Different sources that we'll look through today, including court records, trade records, medical texts, plays, poetry, and secular literature, can all contribute to an understanding of food history. There's a couple of concepts that are really important to what we're going to talk about today, and those are these four. Economic development in the context of food history, simply put, a community that cannot feed itself is a community that does not survive. What this translates to is competition for resources, intercommunity interactions for resource cooperation and competition, as well as different forms of resource acquisition. And through all of those interactions, exchange of food concepts happens. And people get introduced to new ways of interacting with food through different cultures in an attempt to broaden their individual society's access to resources. The next is foodways. The technical definition of a foodway is the eating habits and culinary practices of a people, region, or historical period. And what that really means is the history of how a group or society feeds itself and what that signals about its identity. The term was coined in 1941 at the University of Chicago, but what it really encompasses is what makes something, a Spanish food or an Islamic food or a Jewish food. Next, we have the global Middle Ages, which in the context of this class, it's really important to remember that in order to truly understand food as a concept, we have to avoid the Eurocentrism that is very common in a lot of period sources. In doing so, we broaden our understanding about how non-European influences on European foodways happened, and they opened the door to the study of those non-European foodways themselves that really broadens our understanding of food in general. And the last concept is written history. Written history of food is also fairly new. Islam and Moorish society have some of the oldest written food history in the world, including the 13th century Anonymous Andalusian and Delicacies of the Table. But cookbooks as a concept took a while to catch on in non-Islamic cultures. So when you balance that lack of the idea of food history as being written down with the complications of access to literacy and the ways literacy was controlled and used to control people, you can see that the foods that do get written down tend to be the things that are economically or socially most important. And so what ends up on a piece of paper tells you a lot about what that particular society valued about food. But it's also why it's important to use a variety of different sources instead of just the obvious one, because those clues might end up hidden in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So Spain in general, before we get into each of the individual pathways of food, is a really fascinating study in agriculture. The best way to think about agriculture in Spain, at least for the purposes of our class, is to equate it to California. If you can grow something in the state of California, you can grow it in Spain and vice versa. There are 5 major climate zones, but the majority of the country is Mediterranean or continental. What these mean are warm, dry summers and relatively mild winters that do not reach the extreme temperatures. This is particularly important for grain and produce development because it allows produce and grain to actually make use of the full length of its growing season without as much risk of rot and degradation due to humidity. That nice growing season allows so much leeway in being able to control factors of production and knowing that a particular farmer has relative safety from environmental damage outside of their control. It's not a be-all end-all, but it does help mitigate some of that overall risk. Mild winters make for further safety on either end of the growing season because you can plant earlier and harvest later, or squeeze in an extra harvest, especially if you're talking about grain and hay. And you don't necessarily have to worry nearly as much about the ground freezing or killing your crops. There are areas of more extreme temperature, particularly around the alpine areas and the Meseta, which is a large desert area in the center of the country. But what they create is a series of rain shadow effects, which is on a mountain range. You generally have one side that tends to be an arid desert, and the other side is shielded from a lot of the harsh conditions of that desert, making some pretty ideal agricultural land on the other side of that mountain. The mountains, particularly in the Pyrenees and the Sistema Central and the Cantabrian Mountains, make for a really rich series of rivers and waterway systems. The major ones we'll pay attention to in this class are the Ebro River, the Duero, the Guadiana, and the Guadalquivir. The delta around the Guadalquivir is incredibly important in cattle production, so we won't touch on it as much, but it also makes for a great area for growing wheat, which we will talk about a little bit. The other 3 rivers, though, played major roles in the territorial disputes that saw shifting power within the country. The next kind of major umbrella topic that we will cover throughout the class is the concept of convivencia and the impact of religion on various different Spanish foodways. The concept of convivencia refers to the coexistence of the 3 major Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And what we understand as the convivencia mundanely is in many ways rose-colored in a way that wasn't accurate. It's a lot more complicated than that. Many people refer to this as the Golden Age of Spain, where all 3 of these religions coexisted in harmony, but as we'll see, that's rarely the actual case, and there were tensions that existed both across time and across borders, and sometimes concurrently. So, just to really drive all of this point home, let's talk about fish and chips. Fish and chips, the really amazingly popular British cuisine, actually started in Persia very, very much earlier than Islam arrived to Spain. as a dish called sikbaj, which is a fish marinated or cooked in vinegar. It made its way to Spain with a variety of different ways of Islamic invaders and cultures, but in Spain it became escabeche, which is a fish confit in vinegar and onions. Sephardic Jews in Spain took escabeche and made it into pescado frito, which is a fried fish served cold with vinegar. In 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain and moved into England, it became what we know today as fish and chips. But even beyond that, escabeche traveled to the Americas with Spanish soldiers and became ceviche, and then pescado frito made its way all the way to Japan with Portuguese Jesuits and became what we know as tempura. And I think it's a beautiful demonstration of the ways that a world so interconnected, both across time and across borders, can drastically affect the way we think about food in a specific place. Food never happens in a vacuum, no matter where you are in time or space. We're going to start with Phoenician arrival in Spain. Now, people have been in Spain long past the Phoenicians. There are settlements and cooking implements that date back to the Neolithic era. There are a lot of really interesting things happening in the Bronze Age and with the Celtiberians. But we want to start with the Phoenicians because they bring something that is today even incredibly emblematic of what makes Spanish food, and that's wine. So, wine grapes, or Vitis vinifera vinifera, or Vitis vinifera sylvestris, were domesticated in 5400 to 5000 BCE at Haji Firuz in Iran and made its way through the Mediterranean with the Phoenicians and Greeks. Different kinds of vinifera and vitis grapes did exist in Spain, but what we know as what became winemaking grapes did come with the Phoenicians when they arrived in 1100 BCE. They started with establishing a series of cities, the first of which was Gadir or Cadiz, and moved throughout the Mediterranean portion of Spain, bringing with them a variety of different architecture types, as well as traditions in export and production of exportable goods. The oldest evidence in a Phoenician settlement is a wine press called a lago in a, I want to say, 600 BC town. I have to double check the handout on that one, where it's a flat plate or platform on which the grapes were stood on and pressed that funneled the juice directly into amphora for fermentation. In 270 BCE, Carthage, which has taken over the Phoenicians by this point, establishes Carthago Nova, which becomes modern-day Cartagena in Spain, and leads into the series of events that gives us Hamilcar Barca and Hannibal Barca and his defeat in 206 BCE, and the significant period of time in which Rome has to subjugate the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula and ends with their full control there. In 2024, the oldest liquid evidence of wine was found in Carmona, Spain, in a Roman mausoleum. This predates the previous record holder by about 300 years, and it is most chemically similar to modern-day Fino sherry, except without the fortification. So post-Rome, from the fall of the Visigoths to the Moors, you might think that Islamic presence in Spain and their religious prohibitions against alcohol would severely damage the wine industry, but it's not necessarily true. Certain dynasties were more tolerant than others, but grapes retained their economic importance in the form of table grapes, raisins, and more. Certain types of wine called near wines, which are made from the leftover components of making grape wine, diluted wines, or a raisin wine called Nabibi were particularly popular, especially for long distance traveling. The first mention of what we know as sherry in the 12th century traveling to England, and also in the 12th century, we see the arrival of the Cistercians into Spain, and with them came some of the most formative parts of the Spanish wine industry. They bring with them the concept of letting grapes sit on their skin after pressing, which extracts flavor, tannins, and anthocyanins, or pigments, from the skin. All of those things also happen to be preservatives that keep wine better for longer. They also introduced the concepts of keeping their wine barrels full so that the wine doesn't overly oxidize in those barrels. This both preserves the wine and helps inform later systems of wine creation in sherry, in which you're filling barrels with wine from different barrels to make sure that that one barrel stays full. And what this should sound like for anybody familiar with Jerez and the region around it is the Solera system of topping up aging barrels while sherry is being made. They also introduced the concept of temperature-controlled storage for both barrels and smaller wine-containing vessels like amphora and bottles. This helps stabilize the wine for longer periods of time, and throughout the 13th century and later, helps make a name for Spanish wine as some of the premier wine production in the world. So in the 14th century, we get some really interesting things around wine regulations, particularly in what makes Rioja Rioja. They're some of the first legal regulations that tie a style of wine to a geographic region and eventually evolve into the DOP system still used today. In the 15th century, the Guild of Raisin and Grape Harvesters of Jerez was formed and is still an active guild. And throughout Europe, Spain grows as this power of wine that has a lot to do with its growing season and the fact that these Cistercian monks bring technology with them that supports this longevity in their wines. Now, Jerez does not, at this point in time, have any sort of fortification like we know today. That was really started by the Dutch in Armagnac and Cognac and likely didn't reach Spain until the Napoleonic era. But because it is a hotter growing season, you get more sugar in the grapes, which turns into a higher ABV after vinification in the wine, which means the wine lasts longer even then. So Spanish wines then, we're talking primarily sweet wines like Fino Sherry. The Palomino family of Jerez is still the same, Palomino Fino family that grape is named after. And that's retained a huge amount of its economic importance over time. They were exported throughout the Roman and Phoenician empires. We have evidence of origins of like maker's marks on amphora and owner's marks from wine in Greece and in the British Isles under the Phoenicians and the Romans. And Spanish wine now is still one of its most economically important crops. Spain has the largest acreage of wine grapes in the world. It is the third largest producer of wine grapes globally, and it remains one of the top 5 exporters globally as well. There are over 200 different varietals of grapes that reside within Spain, and that production is split pretty evenly between red and white wine. Grapes over time in Spanish cookbooks show really interestingly how that economic importance retained value, as well as the kinds of ways that Spain interacted with grapes, even past the Phoenicians. So in the Anonymous Andalusian, there are 21 different recipes that mention grape or grape products. That goes up to 37 about a century later in the Livre de Saint-Sauveur, and up to 72 in Ruperto de Nola's 16th century Libro de Guisados. All of these different individual things can come from the same sorts of grapes that wine can, and wine grapes eventually, wine grapes came first, table grapes and raisin grapes all came after that. Now, this survey also leaves out one really important category, which is the mention of vinegar, because vinegar can come from a lot of things, not just grape-based wines, and very often the kind of vinegar is not specified, but vinegar is, if it were on this list, would blow all of the other numbers about wine and grape derivatives out of the water. So the recipes for this particular section are fun. They are varieties of spiced wine throughout the ages. A handful of Spanish relevant recipes for spiced wine are available throughout SCA periods, and they're really interesting to compare and contrast the two. My favorites are looking at what Apicius does under the Romans and the 2 or 3 different recipes that Nola has in his 16th century book. Spice wine and Hippocras, which is what's going to be most familiar in terms of a name to SCA participants, do date back to the Romans and Roman doctor Hippocrates, But there's a lot of different forms of spiced wine, so I've kind of left this very vague. Post Rome, the most common spices tend to be cinnamon, ginger, galangal, cardamom, coriander, and nutmeg. But before a lot of that Islamic trade starts bringing those spices into Europe and the European palate, we see Apicius's recipe with pepper and mastic and bay laurel and saffron and date pits, not dates themselves. And see, it's a really different contrast. The later period recipes tend to be what we would all think of more when we think of spiced or mulled wine, versus Apicius's recipe, which is a lot brighter and more refreshing. Reds can be, or wines can be red, white, or both, or a mix if you're feeling really fun. And that's really depending on time and place of the recipe. So for the Apicius wine that you see down here, I did use Fino Sherry to try to match the chemical profile of what was found in that 2024 find. But no matter what recipe you're looking at, the ultimate goal is an infused, smooth drink without large chunks of spices in it, and those shouldn't remain behind. The wines themselves are always sweetened, though the mode of sweetening varies. The most common spices between the multiple recipes we looked at were cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and saffron. Two of the three recipes mentioned use heat to both incorporate the sweetening agent and to infuse the spices before straining, but not every recipe does, so you can just let this sit and slow steep over time. Apicius' recipe for fine spice wine and Nola's spices for clarea are both included in the handout and were both scaled to approximately one 750 milliliter bottle of wine. Apicius' recipe is Fino Sherry based, and it's fabulously interesting. It's ideal for dilution. So it is a heavily sweetened recipe. And so in the handout, you'll see that I recommend diluting it about 2 parts wine to 1 part water, but it's bright and refreshing and really interesting. The date pits act a little bit like ground cherry kernels, so machlab, and give it a kind of interesting resinous note that plays well with the mastic. Nola's spices for clarea are based on a white wine drink, but it is much closer to what a modern palate would think of when they think of spiced wine. From the Phoenicians, we move on to Rome. And food historian Massimo Montanari, author of Medieval Tastes, Food, Cooking, and the Table, coined the term civilizing plant to describe commodity crops that form the center of a developing economy that builds into a culture. And essentially, these plants become the backbone of an agricultural economy, and the development of agricultural systems grows around their domestication and production into economic systems and into cultural systems. Examples of these plants include rice in East Asia, corn and maize in Central and South America, sorghum in Africa, and most importantly for this class, wheat in the Mediterranean and the Levant. That is not to say that wheat did not exist in Spain prior to the Romans. It absolutely did. However, over time, the types of wheat that were most common changed. Hulled wheats like einkorn, emmer, and spelt, along with free threshing wild wheats, are all native to the Iberian Peninsula, dated back to 6000 BCE. The Celtiberians were really prolific beer brewers with grain-based beers, and we can trace breads called tortas that were commonly made with these harder wheats, along with acorn and grasses like buckwheat and rye. What makes wheat important under the Romans actually comes down to how one defines wheat quality. And wheat quality is the ability of a variety of wheat to produce flour equitable to a specific product. And in Roman Spain, that specific product was yeast leavened breads. And that's where durum wheat comes in. Unlike the other wheats that we've talked about so far, durum is a naked wheat, which means it's lacking this outer hull or shell. It makes it a lot easier to mill, it makes it a lot easier to hybridize and adapt to new different environments, and it translates to a finer flour with less chaff at the end of the day. The durum wheat was I want to say it existed in Spain, but it was not economically important until the Romans looked at Spain and said, we need to grow a lot of durum wheat. really, really quickly. And once they completed the subjugation of the Iberian Peninsula, they had a lot of land that was really well suited to do it, but they didn't have the infrastructure. And so they started giving out that land. They started giving people homes. They started giving people estates. And those estates were called latifundia. These represent large agricultural estates that were dedicated to a variety of different commodity crop production and to livestock production. And they did this to both tie individuals to land and to help institutionalize the pros of assimilation into Rome. Wheat takes a lot of room to farm. So these large estates gave people a reason to be there and again acted as a major reward for the Romanization of the peninsula. Many of these estates surrounded the Guadalquivir Valley, where Jaén, Cordoba, and Sevilla were the primary wheat growing areas. And while the Romans may have set the stage for this system of estates, they were certainly not the last to benefit from it. Under the Visigoths, the Lex Visigothorum, or the Law of the Visigoths, enshrined aristocratic property rights to these formed estates. After that, during the Reconquista, came the fueros, which are larger municipality land grants that could be as small as estates, but could also be as large as the crowns of Leon and Castilla and Aragon themselves, that formed the individual kingdoms. For individuals during the Reconquista, primarily of the Hidalgo, Caballero, and Letrado classes, estate grants called mercedes or haciendas were given at the whim of the crown for services rendered or sometimes as an enticement for larger religious conversions. We see that a lot in the 13th century, and was a part of the way that these Christian kings encouraged people to settle in land retaken from Islamic Spain. This hacienda system eventually evolved into the encomienda system, which in the New World established the first large agricultural plantations and became the bases, like the physical bases for the transatlantic trade of goods and enslaved peoples. From there also grew the mission system that shaped modern municipalities in the Americas, like California and Mexico, which to this day, most of their major urban centers were the mission systems established under under Spain as part of colonial expansion. The recipe we've got for this section is a fun one. It's bread. This is modeled off of a preserved Roman bread from Herculaneum called panes quadratus. Other Roman breads common to Spain during this time included panes militares, or galetas, which were made by traveling Roman soldiers, and flatbreads baked on tagine-like ovens called kilbanos. This recipe included in the class mixes durum wheat and spelt flour for a slightly heavier but really beautifully nutty loaf. And it's based on work done by both the British Museum and food historian Pharrell Monaco. I've made adjustments based on my own bread baking experience, trying to remove some of the more modern techniques that both of those sources use, like slap and folds and the introduction of bench resting and autolysis, which don't really have a lot of support in older bread manuals like Pliny's works. And you'll note in the handout that my recipes for bread tend to be written in baker's percentages, because what really matters is the balance of ingredients, not the specific volumes. So I use a 50-50 mix of durum wheat flour to spelt or buckwheat flour. I'm not a huge fan of buckwheat. You can do it, but it makes a weird, very dense, very gray bread. So if that represents a 1 in the ratio, the hydration percentage is 55% of that 100% of flour. So whatever you've got in weight of flour, a little more than half of that in water, and then starter to help get that yeast going. So the other fun thing about the starter is that Pliny does actually have a recipe for starter. I make my starter the modern way, which is really just flour and water. But Pliny recommended harvesting the wild yeast off of grapes by taking a bunch of grapes, sticking them in a cloth bag, and soaking them in the water before adding that water to the flour to feed your starter. As a frame of reference, my modern day starter for the same, or modern day bread loaf for the same amount of starter in the handout is 100% durum wheat, and my hydration percentages tend to be closer to 75 to 80%. For a non-wheat flour inclusion like buckwheat or rye, a higher hydration percentage can help, especially because those non-wheat inclusions don't generally have gluten to develop, and so more water can help your bread stay a little bit lighter. I make this bread a lot like I make pasta by slowly incorporating the liquids in a well in like a big old pile of flour and bringing them in from the side. This helps getting a little bit of extra time to develop the gluten in the spelt flour, which has a more complex gluten structure than durum wheat does.
Are the baker's percentages by weight or by volume?
That's the beauty of them being percentages, is it can be either. It is about the balance. I prefer to do this by weight because I bake just about everything by weight, but you can do it by volume if you so chose. Um, the last kind of fun thing about this loaf before we're moving on to our next section is the shaping. So this loaf could be shaped a couple of different ways. The original loaf has some very deep grooves in it that you could theoretically get by scoring, but the deepest groove around the waist of that loaf is made by tying a string around the belly. You could also then tie strings in the lovely little star pattern that we see here to get those nice deep grooves, but it gives it this tiny little carrying handle so you can travel with your bread really easily. So now that we've talked a little bit about Rome and the Phoenicians, we're going to move on to Islamic Spain. And what I want to focus on in Islamic Spain is the language of food. It's important to talk about the words that we use for food and their origins because it really shows how we think about food in the context of the world that it is in. In modern Spanish, which derives from Castilian Spanish, there are about 8,000 words that are either loaner words from Arabic or are Arabic in origin, including about 2,000 that are the words that we use for iconic Spanish foodstuffs. So I put a couple of them here, but the most important one on this list for us is the word naranja for orange. And in this section, we'll talk a little bit about written word and food culture as well. But before we get there, why have I skipped the Visigoths? What about the Visigoths? Not a lot specific about Visigothic food history survives to today. But what we do know of it is that a lot of it runs counter to Roman culture. So they specifically preferred beer over wine and pork fat over olive oil and so on. But this in some ways has in some ways led to an overall decrease in agricultural biodiversity under the Visigoths. But the Visigoths had something else acting against them that prevented a rich food culture or the preservation thereof, and that is the environment. So far, we've talked a lot about how humans influence agriculture, and the way that agriculture influences humans is important too. In 2023, a study was done of pollen records and sediment records in bodies of water in Spain to see if periods of drought or the loss of overall plant biodiversity could be identified, and this study found 4 statistically significant periods of drought. When this study compared the times of those periods to historical event records, they found a pattern that tied a couple of critically important moments of power vulnerability closely to those drought periods. The first period of 545 to 570 CE corresponds closely or immediately predates the Visigothic Civil War in 580 to 585 CE, where records throughout the world, including in Byzantium and Italy, noted major periods of drought, famine, and the Justinian plague. Incidentally, when those drought conditions started to improve and people started to bounce back from that, the political instability of that civil war also started to improve. The second period immediately precedes and overlaps with the fall of the Visigoths. So immediately before the arrival of the Berbers and the Moors in northern Africa in 711, there were several years between 707 and 709 CE of severe famine and drought that led to a series of bits of political unrest and a lot of instability and lack of unity within Visigothic society that really made it prime pickings for Islamic invasion. The third and the fourth periods kind of correspond to major political upheavals in Moorish Spain. So the third period, from 775 to 770 CE, corresponds to the breaking of the Caliphate of Spain with the Caliphate of Baghdad. In 756 CE, the Umayyads decided to break with the Abbasid Caliphate and establish the independent emirate of Cordoba. The last period of 900 to 935 CE corresponds with the first fitna, or Islamic civil war, in which Abd-Rahman III declares himself caliph in 929 and enjoys a reign, and by enjoys I mean not at all, enjoys a reign plagued with political upheaval, drought, and famine. Less than 100 years later, the Caliphate of Cordoba falls and the Taifa kingdoms are born. The long and the short of it is that in the time period that we're covering in this class, where about 60% of the wealth is attributed to agriculture, and agriculture as a sector employs approximately 80% of the population, political power structures live and die by their relationship with agriculture and its relationship to the environment around it. So back to Islamic Spain and the written word. We have a handful of surviving cookbooks, and the ones that I've spent time with that are relevant to this class are Delicacies of the Table, written sometime around the 13th century, the Kitab al-Tabikh, or the Anonymous Andalusian, written in the 13th century that was later translated in the 15th century, the Libro de Saint-Sauvy from 14th century Catalonia, and the Libro de Guisados from 16th century Castilla that was originally published elsewhere. If we have more questions on where and how that particular book created, I have a whole other class on that one. But one of the things that the Dar Islam, or the House of Islam, referring to the community of Islamic states around the world, does have is some of the richest written medieval food history, even outside of these individual books. So in the 9th century, a court poet in Spain and a music teacher named Ziryab wrote a manual detailing the rules and etiquette of food, including a variety of different recipes and the order in which dishes should be served when they're being presented in a banquet. He also had some really interesting recipes for cosmetics and perfume in that book. But this is some of the oldest specifically written recipes and addresses of how food is interacted with that we have. So we have some fun comparing, what is written food culture under Islamic Spain and what is written food culture under Christian Spain. But Christian Spain did take a little, and really the rest of the Christian world took a little while longer to catch up to the concept of a cookbook as we understand it today. But what does that have to do with oranges? So oranges and other citrus fruits originate about 8 million years ago in Yunnan, China, with a singular common citrus ancestor. And the varieties that we're familiar with today resulted from a variety of different crossbreeds between different types of citrus that were all chosen for specific attributes. So the first written evidence of oranges themselves comes from the 4th century in China and had reached the Arabic Empire by the 10th century. However, oranges were not the first citrus to reach the Iberian Peninsula. That honor belongs to citrons, or more commonly to Jewish listeners, etragi. Oranges then traveled across the Atlantic with Columbus, and by the mid-16th century had reached North America in Florida. In Al-Andalus, oranges were primarily used for cosmetics and as ornamental garden plants, and are kind of a tribute to the commitment to garden culture that Moorish Spain very much valued. So, oranges in period versus oranges today. Oranges are a great demonstration of a few cool concepts for this class, but the most interesting, I think, is that the word orange for the color orange actually post-dates the word orange itself. We call the color orange because of the fruit, not the other way around. The etymological origins of the word orange tie back to Arabic with the word naranj, which becomes the word naranja in Spanish, but can be traced all the way back to Tamil, which is considered the first real codified language. Analyzing different cookbook sources we've come across so far in this class shows a kind of interesting pattern. The oranges most common in our period, particularly in Spain, were sour oranges, which are still very emblematic of Sevilla and Valencia today. They weren't super pleasant to eat, though. Most of the surviving orange recipes mention orange juice to balance out sourness and sweetness in a recipe. So we've got 4 recipes in Saint-Sauvy that use oranges and specifically orange juice. The Libro de Guisados has 42, but the Anonymous Andalusian only has 1 actual orange recipe, and that's the recipe we'll explore in just a second. Today, Spain has the highest agricultural density of orange groves by square footage, meaning of all of the agricultural square footage in Spain, more of that, a higher percentage of that is dedicated to oranges than almost anywhere else in the world. It is one of the top 10 producers globally by volume. The city of Sevilla hosts 40,000 individual orange trees, which is the most in the world in an urban setting, and the oldest living orange tree, which is supposed to be about 600 years old in the Alcazar. The recipe for this section is orange paste from the Anonymous Andalusian, and it is a cute little after-dinner candy. It is a honey and orange marmalade that is caramelized and significantly reduced enough that it firms up and holds its shape over time. It's not a hard candy, it's nice and chewy. And the recipe is pretty darn simple. It is a 3-to-1 by weight ratio of honey to orange peels, cooked down until it becomes this deep, deep red. I used Cara Cara oranges because the original recipe specifies red oranges, but other orange varieties will do. Closely removing the skin and not bringing a lot of overall pith does improve the flavor and the texture of the candies. In the handout, you'll see two different methods. The original, which soaks the orange skins until tender, and then a slightly faster method of boiling the orange skin that is based on a later period recipe for candied citron. Both work equally well.
So first question from chat is, could you please share more information about the 9th century Spanish book on dining customs?
I wish I could. I have not managed to find a copy of that yet. I'm still working on that because I am absolutely fascinated by it. But what I do know is a decent amount about the author. He was a music teacher under Al-Rahman II and Al-Hakam the third or first. Don't quote me on that. And it became a bit of a cultural icon in the courts of Al-Andalus as the trendsetter. He was the, social media influencer of the day. And so he used kind of that popularity to sort of impose how he felt manners should work, as well as what he decided were, was the height of elegance for eating at the time. And that's what his book became. I am still hunting for a copy of the book itself so that I can read it. And if I find it, I will let you know.
Second question, why Cara Cara instead of blood oranges?
Because Cara Cara oranges genetically predate blood oranges. Blood oranges are a later crossbreed that if I'm remembering my research correctly, is attributable to breeding practices in North America.
Where would we find Cara Cara? Because I don't think my supermarket carries them.
It really depends. I've seen them in a couple of different places. They are most genetically close to navel oranges, so you might see them listed as Cara Cara navel oranges. I just happen to get them at my supermarket because my supermarket has them. Any other questions?
I'm looking at that recipe for the orange paste and trying to gather the courage.
It is so easy. It is so tasty.
But the pith would make it so, if you even have a little bit of pith, it'll just sour it up, won't it?
The boiling method helps with that. I don't know if you're familiar with citrons as a fruit, but they are almost entirely pith. It's probably a good 1 to 1.5 inches thick of pith. And so the boiling method helps that a lot, and you can boil it repeatedly to remove some of the bitterness. But what I did was I used a vegetable peeler to peel off as little as I could of the actual skin and then scraped it of any remaining pith. We're going to talk about Reconquista and La Mesta and the role of lamb in Spain. So Iberia has been home to all of the major species of domesticated livestock before human and humanoid inhabitants. Sheep and goats were domesticated first on the peninsula, followed by cattle and pigs. The quintessential Spanish aged ham that we all know and love has been traced all the way back to the Celtiberians and possibly predates them as well. For this section, we'll be focusing on the movements of livestock, the concept of public access livestock spaces, and the effects that those have on the environment. Both Rome and Islamic Spain moved livestock around, though likely at a much smaller scale than we'll see under Christian Spain. But cross-border trade and movement have been tracked to both civilizations in terms of tolls and ledgers, as well as trade documents. Full disclosure, there is a class later today on transhumance in medieval Europe in general. I hope to see people there that will probably go into that concept a lot more in depth than I will. But the growth of sheep as an industry in Spain has a lot to do with major concepts of repopulation and unionization. Where the story really begins to get interesting is the 12th century. During this time, the Reconquista was progressing a little bit more pointedly, and Christian Spain continued to take territory from Islamic Spain, but they had one big problem, is that they didn't have enough people to actually hold it. Holding conquered land doesn't just require soldiers, it requires settlers. It needs people to not only occupy the space, but to heal the physical damage from fighting and long-term warfare, to establish the economic interests of the claiming party in that area, and to create networks of communication that protect and facilitate the security of conquered land as well. So in 1118, Alfonso I conquers Zaragoza and is faced with this big problem. His solution was to incentivize the economic interest of a couple of people that could really quickly occupy a lot of space, and that is large stock breeders and sheep herders. To do this, he offered major concessions on the right to graze crown lands to large sheep herds in the area, and he offered those rights in perpetuity. Free access to protectable grazing land is not something that anybody turns down. So sheep herds moved into the area and helped really truly establish Zaragoza as a Christian holding. In 1218, formalized structures in the area were starting to take shape to allow those large stock breeders and owners to form negotiating blocks, standards of ownership and occupancy rights, as well as branding conventions and what made the standard of industry in the area. The Casa de Ganaderos, or the House of Stock Breeders, was founded and in Zaragoza in 1218, and the guild still operates today. Individual municipality guilds like the Casa de Ganaderos would prove incredibly helpful in structuring and growing a conglomerated view of the Spanish sheep industry. And so in 1273, an umbrella organization called La Mesta was formed and signed into law to protect the migratory herds of sheep that had started taking over and becoming economically important as the Reconquista progresses. La Mesta represents not just the organization of unionized sheepholders and stock breeders, but also the series of roads called Cañadas Reales that allow for the long-distance movement of sheep herds to maximize grazing potential of what would become one of Spain's most lucrative crops, wool. By 1400, 1.5 million sheep were moved annually on La Mesta, and that number would grow to a peak of 3.2 million by the early 16th century. La Mesta remained economically important until the mid-19th century, when its legal protections were revoked. At the time of its dissolution, it still influenced the raising of approximately 1.5 million merino sheep. That said, as big as La Mesta was, as economically important as La Mesta was, and livestock movements were, at every point in time, local non-migratory herds still outnumbered the sheep managed on La Mesta. So La Mesta represents a kind of agriculture called transhumance. Transhumance is the seasonal movement of livestock to optimize for a concept called pasture complementarity. And what that means is that sometimes in the year, some pastures are better than others, and other times those flip. So you move your animals to where the grass is. There are several different kinds of transhumance, all of which were practiced in Spain. The first, and what most people familiar with the concept think of when I use the term transhumance, is vertical transhumance. This involves the movement of livestock up and down valleys and mountains throughout the year. The system uses complementarity between low elevations during the months of roughly October through May, and moves them up into the montane and subalpine belts of mountains from May through October. The best modern example of this is the French Alps and the large-scale cheeses that are made as those animals move up and down the mountains. Another common form of transhumance is called transterminance. And it specifically refers to the movement of livestock within a single valley or mountain. And the easiest way to think of this on a macro scale is rotational grazing, which is still one of the most powerful agricultural tools livestock production has today. And lastly, is horizontal transhumance, which is exactly what La Mesta is. Horizontal transhumance is the long distance movement of livestock to maximize complementarity between different regions. In Spain, this meant merino sheep wintered in the pastures of Extremadura, La Mancha, and Andalusia, and moved on to León and Old Castilla and northeastern La Mancha in the spring. There are a couple of social and economic conditions that make transhumance work. The first is a period of population growth, like the Reconquista, where Christian Spain was committed to not only the overall growth of its population in volume, but also to square footage as well. Relative prosperity and market conditions for the stabilization and outward expansion of markets also corresponds to a net upward trend in wealth building tendencies and the ability for people to invest in larger herds. Political stability for large-scale administration is a few things contributed to this. First was a common goal of driving Muslims out of Spain and reconquering the entirety of the peninsula. But secondly, several key structures of bureaucracy came to prominence during this time, including improvements in record keeping, the expansion of the role of governmental notaries, and the unionization of sheep herders and owners to form their own market-driven record-keeping and bureaucratic structures. And what this turns into is this really fascinating comparison. Amazingly, again, as economically important as La Mesta was, even at the scales mentioned a couple of slides ago, at all points in time, local sheep herds and non-migratory livestock herds still outnumbered the sheep managed on these systems. But that doesn't mean that transhuman systems did not play a major role in reshaping the distribution of livestock in Spain. The two images shown here, taken from a paper by Karl Butzer, shows a great before and after of where sheep lived in the Iberian Peninsula. The image on the left shows the early distribution of critical livestock farming areas on the peninsula, with sheep highlighted for clarity. So you see them around kind of the peripheries here. And this goes up through Roman occupation. On the right, this shows the distribution of sheep herds in the mid-16th century. The red outlined area is where sheep outnumber cattle by more than 10 to 1. The yellow outlined areas is where sheep outnumber cattle by less than 5 to 1. Note that in both areas, sheep still greatly outnumber cattle. Comparing the two images shows us a decidedly inward and eastward movement of sheep herds, a shift that follows the common use pasture concessions and some of the major urban centers of La Mesta as a bureaucratic organization. These geographic shifts cause physical changes in the environment around them as well. So the subalpine and montane belts in the Pyrenees have risen approximately 500 to 600 meters in tree line elevation, corresponding to long-term deforestation effects tied to higher periods of livestock activity. And it's not just geographically that the balance shifts in sheep popularity, but in those cookbooks that we mentioned too. Comparing the named proteins in the 14th century Libro de Saint-Sauvy and the 16th century Libro de Guisados, we see a key shift in the popularity of lamb and pork in particular. So from Saint-Sauvy to Nola, there is a roughly 78% increase in the number of explicitly mentioned lamb ingredients in the two cookbooks, with a 44% decrease in the number of pork mentioned. There is also a 54% decrease in the mention of generic meats and other proteins like game. Additionally, there's a shift in those pork mentions from pork as a primary protein to the use of lard and bacon as ingredients, whereas the lamb mentions skew more from lamb bones and lamb stock into lamb as a primary protein in those dishes. Our recipe for this section is a mutton stew, and it is from both Saint-Sauvy and the Libro de Guisados. The Libro's recipe is very clearly a derivative of Saint-Sauvy with a couple of fun things added. An interesting feature of both recipes is the presence of multiple thickening agents. So the final recipe that we present in the handout uses ground almonds, ground liver, soaked bread, all of which combine to the final texture of the stew along with the rendered collagen from the lamb meat. It's a bit liver forward, but if you like that, and I do, it's a really homey, pleasant stew. But it also features some fun ingredients like honeyed quince or honeyed apples, and is a really fascinating balance between the concepts of what makes something sweet and savory in period. It's also a little bit sour due to the vinegar and gives you an opportunity to kind of play with that balance as well if that's something you like. Questions? So we're going to move on to Inquisition and expulsion. And Jewish history on the Iberian Peninsula dates back to Rome. Various Greek and Roman invasions into the native homeland of the Jews resulted in Roman supremacy in modern-day Israel and Palestine. Some of the more well-known incidents are the mass suicides at Masada and the Bar Kokhba revolts. This time also corresponds with the creation of the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the critically important definitions of, how does one be Jewish? Much like the rest of the diaspora, relationships between Jews and the ruling classes shifted a lot over time and eventually began to deteriorate in Judea. This shift saw Jewish communities moving deeper into the Roman Empire to established Jewish communities through Persia and then westward, ultimately into Spain. Convivencia, or the religious coexistence between those three Abrahamic religions that we talked about, is a loaded subject. The term itself implies a form of cohabitation, but as the reality often is, it's a lot more complex. However complex the Jewish existence in Spain was homeland of some of the most influential Jewish thinkers of all time, including Rabbi Moses Bar Moses, more commonly known as the Rambam or Maimonides, and Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Code of Jewish Law. He was born in Toledo in 1488. We're going to park here for a second and talk about eating while Jewish. Eating as a Jewish person is a fascinatingly layered, intentional, and deeply personal choice. So before I really dive into what that is, in full disclosure for some of our viewers that may not know me, I myself am Jewish. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is informed by my experiences of being Jewish, and know that so many people have their own experiences of what eating while Jewish is like. Many people know about the common Jewish food restrictions, such as the prohibitions against consuming meat and dairy together, of consuming pork and shellfish, and that the prohibition against working on Shabbat affects how Jews cook and eat during the week. This barely scratches the surface of how the concept of kashrut, or the laws of what makes something an okay food for Jews, and several other things, work, but it's important to keep in mind in this particular context. These interactions get layered with the observance of specific holidays like Passover or Pesach, where it is prohibited to consume or benefit from chametz, which is leavened bread and certain grains exposed to water, or Yom Kippur when we fast. On top of these layers is the concept of minhagim, or local community traditions that are so integral to the identity of the community that they become and supersede Talmudic law. It is these traditions that allow for the laws of kashrut to grow and change over time, and why New World animals like turkeys can be accounted for properly under Jewish food laws. A great example of this that is relevant to Spain is Pesach and the concept of kitniot. During Passover, we are prohibited from consuming or benefiting from specific grains when they have been in contact with water. But there's this whole category of food called kitniot, which the best way I can describe it to non-Jewish people is that isn't chametz, but it sure looks like it if you squint hard enough. And this includes things like legumes, potatoes, and rice. Technically, rules as written, these things should be okay to consume during Passover. But there are concerns that have been expressed by individual authorities on the subject that someone who is less well-versed in the laws of kashrut might see somebody eating something like potatoes, rice, and their derivatives, like rice flours, and thinking because they seem like they could be chametz, that chametz is okay to consume during Passover, eventually leading to them breaking that prohibition. Alternatively, it can be construed as taking advantage of a loophole, particularly in communities that don't consume those kitniot outside of Pesach. And that's where Minchagim come in. Communities like Ashkenazi communities, who for a very long time did not regularly consume potatoes, rice, etc., had a prohibition against the consumption of kitniot that was in place until 2016 when a large group of rabbis from the conservative movement overturned it. Alternatively, a lot of Sephardi and Mizrahi communities, where rice is commonly consumed outside of Pesach and formed an integral part of local diets, had no such prohibition. And so they're allowed to eat that kitniot during Pesach. Given the complexities of this system and the long-term residence of Jews in Spain, it should be no surprise that local Islamic and Christian foodways made their way into Jewish food and vice versa. But what makes a food Jewish? Determining the answer to that question is a fabulous way to explore alternative sources of food history. Dr. Helene Jahar Pinheiro of the University of Tours published Jews' Food in Spain in 2022 and tracked some of these identifiers through the Anonymous Andalusian, which has several specifically named Jewish recipes, into Inquisition court records, contemporary plays, poetry, and more to come up with a list of a handful of items that were Jewish coded in medieval Spain. That list is below on this slide, so I'm not going to go over them individually. And while many of these food items were eaten by non-Jews, particularly those of lower socioeconomic status, they were considered as part of a body of evidence to determine someone's Jewishness when faced with an inquisitorial trial. We're going to focus on eggplant for this class because it is an enduringly Jewish coded food. There are only 5 eggplant recipes in Nola's Libro de Guisados. Eggplant has been at different times during history referred to as a Jewish apple and considered a undesirable food because of its coloration and some of the ways that people characterize Jews in period. So this recipe is from Nola's Libro de Guisados. It is a roasted eggplant casserole with cheese and spices, and it has a handful of Jewish coded choices in it, other than being fabulously delicious. First is the eggplant itself as the Jewish coded ingredient. Second is the use of the cazuela, or the casserole style cooking method. Third is the presence of cilantro instead of ground coriander, so the actual leaf of that plant. And lastly, the absence of any pork or pork-based products in a non-Catholic fast day recipe. All of this together adds together to imply that this dish is a product of Jewish food pathways even after the expulsion of Jews in 1492. A survey of the Libro de Guisados compared to Pinheiro's full list of ingredients and customs confirms 10 individual recipes that have at least 4 markers of those Jewish pathways in them as well, and that list is complete in the handout. Questions so far? Now we move on to the Age of Empire as well as colonialism. After 1492, the Spanish economic attention turns westward towards the Americas, and with that comes a boom in the transatlantic trade, including groceries and foods from the Americas and the global south. Spain readily embraced maize, and different forms of corn, and later, after they came face to face with the unfortunate realities of pellagra, they also embraced nixtamalization, which introduces lime to corn to help release the niacin. And they were big fans of sweet potatoes, but tomatoes and other foods faced an uphill battle in acceptance in European society. At the height of this trade, foodstuffs made up about 37% of the economic value of the transatlantic trade. Before the arrival of the Europeans, chocolate still held an incredibly special place in the food culture of South America and Mesoamerica. Its domestication dates back to 3500 to 3350 BCE in the Andes and 1900 to 1500 BCE in Mexico. And those traces are based on chemical markers on archaeological finds of pottery that cue that yes, cacao was in this. Cacao was primarily consumed as a beverage, though there were maize-based foods and other recipes for actual solid foods that included cacao as well. But the beans themselves could be used as currency and were traded as reparations for wartime losses or as part of an actual trade exchange as well. The drink itself was used primarily for royalty and nobility, often around special occasions and life cycle events, but it could be used for those special occasions and life cycle events in lower classes if you can afford it. In addition to chocolate itself, the tools necessary to make and consume chocolate were considered status symbols and made for really esteemed gifts. Though, interestingly, the molinillo, the wooden stirring spoons, emblematic of drinking chocolate today, were a Spanish introduction, not an indigenous American tool. What makes chocolate special? Other than being wildly delicious, chocolate is chemically interesting for the purposes of this class. Drinking chocolate, not tea and not coffee, was actually the first drinkable stimulant introduced into the European diet. Cacao itself contains caffeine and theobromine, both of which are chemical stimulants and vasodilators. Additionally, depending on the recipes used, those recipes also contain capsaicin, which is also a chemical stimulant and vasodilator. Speaking from experience as a consummate coffee drinker, the recipe for this class will make you feel all three of those chemical compounds. Chocolate was imported to Spain starting in 1544 and rapidly became wildly popular. In fact, it was so popular that roughly 60 years later, the Spanish clergy was writing to the Vatican to determine whether or not drinking chocolate broke the limitations of ecclesiastical fasts. Several texts utilizing American goods in medical contexts helped bring chocolate and goods like tobacco into the zeitgeist of Spanish food in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain wanted to monopolize this transatlantic trade system and ultimately failed to do so. But market-driven capitalism and the institutions that prop it up, like shipping, banking, insurance, manufacturing, and more, were greatly expanded during this time period of colonization. Imports of gold and silver from the Americas during this time even drove a reimagining of the concepts of capital accumulation, and economists from both sides of the aisle agree that profits from this era of trade, particularly surrounding those foodstuffs, led to the Industrial Revolution as we understand it. Now, this table is a lot to look at, but it is a comparison of 4 different 17th century hot chocolate recipes. 2 of these recipes are from Spanish explorer Santiago de Valverde Turices, and 2 of them are from Dr. Antonio Columnero de Ledesma. The trends in these 4 recipes are pretty interesting. All 4 predictably contain cacao and sugar, though at different ratios. All 4 contain cinnamon, chili, and have aniseed as an option, though future European-focused recipes would later include mace and cardamom as well. And 3 of the 4 recipes contain cloves. Of the recipes, I did choose to explore recipe number 1 for the purposes of this class. And there are a couple of interesting challenges with these 4 recipes. Conversions are really interesting. So in order to balance the ratios of these recipes, we need to know the information that the average cacao bean weighs approximately 2 grams. We also need to know that some of these ingredients use the same words for different scales of measurement. This recipe in particular focuses on ingredients that would use apothecary pounds, not standard pounds. And what that means is a 12-ounce pound instead of a 16-ounce pound. We need to know that a real is a unit of currency used to reference the amount of aniseed needed. An 8 reales piece discovered in Jamestown from slightly later than this period weighed 27 grams, so we can extrapolate from there to figure out how much aniseed is needed. Lastly is the pepper. The pepper does not specify fresh or dried, though at least in the first of Ledesma's recipes, it's implied that it's dried, given where it sort of flows in the ingredients. There's a couple of different potential pepper choices. Cayenne is possible. You can make that choice. From experience, I don't recommend you use the full 80 grams of cayenne that recipe calls for or something like that. Spanish sweet paprika is another choice that makes it a little bit boring. I've done this recipe a couple of times. Cayenne, again, is a brave choice. You can make it. Your mileage may vary on your spice tolerance. I really like a 3 parts sweet paprika to 1 part cayenne recipe, just because it allows you to actually taste all of the other spices that go into it. So the other interesting about this recipe is the chocolate itself. I don't know about you, but I do not have access to cacao beans, nor do I have the ability to adequately roast them myself in a apartment in Tysons Corner, Virginia. So in order to balance that out, I used 100% dark baking chocolate, and this recipe works really well with it. It is neither overly bitter nor overly sweet. Ledesma doesn't reference in either of his two recipes that I looked at whether water or milk should be used, but according to food historian Joyce White, both are acceptable based on other recipes of his. I prefer the drink with milk. Feel free to try either. The resultant drink is this beautifully spiced chocolate drink that is very warming and rich.
The one question is not a long pepper or black pepper or white pepper for the chocolate pepper.
That's a really great question. To talk about that, we need to go back to actually talking about the spice trade itself and where those peppers come from, because those peppers do not come from the New World. Those are primarily from the Indian subcontinent, and the actual text of this specific recipe reads of long red pepper. Neither of those is a long red pepper. They do fruit, but the way that this pepper is recipe is particularly written, and the way his later recipe, which refers to a different kind of long pepper or a Spanish pepper, specifically calls it a tongue of the Indians, it leads you to believe that it is not, in fact, long pepper or Tellicherry pepper. And then modern recipes and modern derivatives of this recipe are all chili pepper based, as are later 17th and 18th century recipes. So chili or paprika or another capsicum is the way to go over long pepper or black pepper. And it is at this time that I do have to tell you that you've just sat through an hour-and-a-half long class on food in Spain, in which neither food nor Spain was the point. What is the point is that foodways and food histories are a tool and a lens through which we can better view the world and see the intricacies of economic, social, and political power being acted on. And for the Phoenicians, it's the introduction of cross-border trade that brings the Iberian Peninsula into the actual expanded market and economic ecosystem of the Mediterranean. For the Romans, it's the concepts of estates controlling farmland at the will and behest of the state as both a means of conquest and subjugation, which laid the foundations for a far-reaching system of an agricultural-based social and economic hierarchy, as well as property law. For the Visigoths, we see that while humans may act on agriculture as an indication of socio-political power, so too can agriculture act on humans. The reciprocity of the human relationship with food systems is ingrained in their very fabric, and both have the ability to make or break the other. For the Moors, food is an integral part about how we talk about and interact with the world. The shaping of language through cultural interaction fundamentally shifts how we perceive food itself. That a color may be defined by a food and the words that we use to talk about it shows just how deeply our perception of food influences our perception of the world. For Reconquista and Christian Spain, shifting agricultural needs shifts the very environment of those needs at its core. The ability for relatively unregulated markets to drive the development of policy, bureaucracy, and social hierarchy is hard to overstate. For expulsion and inquisition, food serves as both a means of establishing identity and a weapon with which to persecute that identity. It is a tool of community and of othering that can be both powerful and enduring in both contexts. For the age of expulsion, we have globalism and colonialism, which are large amorphous concepts that have fingers in everything we do today. The competition for resources is as old as time immemorial, regardless of what those resources are, and they can alter the course of a society and a world entirely. And so wherever we look at food, we should be seeing the evidence of it shaping the world and the people around that food. Thank you so much for this. I am so glad you all joined me today for this definitely dense class. And I really, really appreciate you going on this journey to talk about food history in the context of food in Spain with me. I'm always happy to talk more about it. And I look forward to seeing y'all in the chat in just a second.